I think we get it. You don't want to answer the
No,
question.
you don't get anything regarding public safety.
Thank you.
Nothing.
Thank you for the insult. It's clear you didn't come to Congress prepared to answer questions that the American people have every right to have.
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Actually, I think the gentlelady from Pennsylvania.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Bondi, I'm here. On September 25th, President Trump signed a memorandum known as NSPM 7, purporting to address domestic terrorism. But Americans across the political spectrum were immediately alarmed by the memo's blurring of the line between unlawful conduct and constitutionally protected speech and activity, as well as its call to investigate, prosecute, and dismantle groups that the president and Stephen Miller described without evidence as, quote, an organized campaign of radical left terrorism. Now, counterterrorism experts were further alarmed by the administration's singular focus on left-wing extremism, combined with the sudden deletion from the DOJ website of decades of research and law enforcement analysis, which had concluded that right-wing extremism poses the greatest terrorism threat to Americans. The president's memo broadly and vaguely links violent conduct to ideologies, and it targeted specifically anti-American, anti-Christian, and anti-capitalist beliefs, as well as, quote, hostility to so-called traditional American views on family, religion, and morality, end quote. President Trump has repeatedly and openly, however falsely, tried to brand his political opponents with these sentiments listed in his memo. But as you know, as a lawyer, holding beliefs that the White House disagrees with is not a crime. And the statute defining domestic terrorism requires criminal acts, not just thoughts and ideas. That's why legal experts, nonprofit leaders, religious freedom, and civil rights advocates immediately raised the alarm that the new presidential directive was a politically motivated attack on civil society designed to silence those who disagree with the administration. So, Ms. Bondi, Section 3 of that memo directed you, as Attorney General, to submit to the President and Stephen Miller a list of groups or entities whose members are engaged in acts that meet the definition of domestic terrorism. And then on December 4th, you directed the FBI to work with a variety of law enforcement entities to compile a list of groups and entities engaged in such acts by January 3rd, 2026, and to update that report every 30 days thereafter. So can we assume that you or persons under your direction at the Department of Justice have prepared that list of groups or entities who are designated as domestic terrorist organizations? And I just remind you that's a yes or no question. Did you prepare the list?
I'm not going to answer it yes or no, but what I will say is I know Antifa is part of that. I will talk to you about that.
I'm reclaiming my time. I asked you whether you
an Antifa member was arrested in Minneapolis federal court for cyber stalking.
Did you
they
have
ask a question
list?
And don't want an answer.
The answer is yes or no.
Time belongs to the gentleman from Pennsylvania. Gentlelady can proceed.
Okay. So will you commit to providing this committee with any list of organizations that you have recommended be designated as domestic terrorist organizations?
We will comply with the law in all matters.
Will you commit to provide this committee with your list of entities that you recommend be designated as domestic terrorist organizations?
I'm not going to commit to anything to you because you won't let me answer questions.
Okay, well then we do understand that your current position is that you have a secret list of people or groups that you are accusing of domestic terrorism, but you won't share it with Congress. And I'd remind you that when the US government designates an entity as a foreign terrorist organization, it must report that to Congress and to the entity, because the government can make a mistake and the entity has the opportunity to contest it. So your position seems to be that if you falsely designate an American or an American organization as a terrorist group, there's nothing they can do about it. I think we get it. You don't want to answer the question.
No, you don't get anything regarding public safety.
Thank you.
Nothing.
Thank you for the insult. It's clear you didn't come to Congress prepared to answer questions that the American people have every right to have answered. But if you were to prepared to answer truthfully, here's what we expect the facts to show. The administration is keeping lists of Americans who the White House says are engaged in domestic terrorism. Those lists could include Americans who have not committed any acts of terrorism, but simply disagree with this administration, people like Renee Good and Alex Preddy. And your list may include clergy, elected officials, and members of indivisible groups across the country. And those lists likely don't include Proud Boys or Oath Keepers who were actually convicted. Americans have never tolerated political demagogues who use the government to punish people on an enemies list. It brought down McCarthy, it brought down Nixon, and it will bring down this administration as well.
And you're right.
I yield back.
That's why we're so glad they rescinded the
That's right.
Memorandum targeting parents. For goodness sake, as the gentleman from California just pointed out in his 5 minutes.
In the closing minutes of this intense congressional hearing, the atmosphere inside the chamber shifted from routine oversight to something far more revealing. Representative Gay Scanlon leaned into the microphone and pressed former Florida Attorney General Pam Bondi with a question that carried weight far beyond the walls of Congress. At the center of the exchange was a directive tied to a presidential memorandum, a policy effort intended to address domestic security threats. But as Scanlon's questions unfolded, the conversation moved quickly from policy language to something deeper: the power of government to label its own citizens and the consequences of such authority. Scanlon described a memo that, in her view, blurred the line between unlawful conduct and constitutionally protected political expression. She pointed to language that appeared to connect acts of violence with broad ideological beliefs, beliefs that millions of Americans hold or debate openly in the public square. For Scanlon, the danger was clear. When government begins to associate political viewpoints with national security threats, the boundaries of lawful enforcement and democratic freedom can begin to overlap in unsettling ways. Bondi responded cautiously. She confirmed that the Department of Justice had indeed been tasked with compiling information about groups whose members may have engaged in activities meeting the legal definition of domestic security threats. Yet when Scanlon asked whether the list of organizations would be shared with Congress, the exchange became tense. Bondi declined to commit. The answer was brief, but the implications echoed loudly through the hearing room. At the center of this debate was the role of the U.S. Department of Justice and its relationship with federal law enforcement agencies, such as the Federal Bureau of Investigation. These institutions occupy a unique position in American democracy. They possess enormous investigative power. But that power exists alongside an equally powerful expectation that it will be exercised carefully, transparently, and without political bias. The exchange between Scanlon and Bondi exposed the tension that arises when those expectations are tested. Scanlon's argument was not simply about one list or one memorandum. It was about the principle that government must never confuse dissent with danger. In a country built on the freedoms of speech, assembly, and belief, disagreement with those in power is not only protected, it is essential. The conversation also reached into a deeper chapter of American political history. Scanlon invoked past moments when leaders used the machinery of government to create lists of perceived enemies. Those moments have always left scars on the nation's democratic institutions. They serve as reminders that power, when unchecked, can drift from protection to intimidation. Bondi, however, approached the issue from another perspective. For those responsible for national security, the task of identifying potential threats is not theoretical. It is practical and immediate. Government officials are expected to act when credible evidence suggests unlawful activity may occur. From that vantage point, compiling information about groups or individuals can be seen not as political targeting, but as preparation, an effort to prevent harm before it takes place. This is the enduring dilemma of democratic governance. Security and liberty often move together, but they do not always move comfortably side by side. Every generation of American leaders must confront the same question: how far can government go in the name of protection without crossing the line that separates vigilance from overreach? What made this hearing moment so striking was how clearly that question surfaced in the exchange. Scanlon warned that secret lists of organizations could include citizens whose only act was to disagree with the administration in power. Bondi resisted the implication that enforcement decisions were politically motivated. Both perspectives reflected a reality that the country continues to grapple with: a deep distrust between political factions about how power is used and why. The hearing room itself became a stage for that broader national conversation. Members of Congress are not only lawmakers, they are also guardians of the system designed to keep government accountable. Oversight hearings like this one are meant to shine light into the spaces where authority and transparency intersect. They force officials to answer questions in public view where citizens can judge the answers for themselves. And that is the deeper meaning of the exchange that unfolded here today. This was not just a dispute about one memo or one investigation. It was a reminder that democracy relies on constant vigilance, not only from government officials, but from the public watching them. Every question asked in that chamber carries a message beyond the hearing itself, that power must always explain itself, and that authority must always be accountable. In moments like this, the American system reveals both its tensions and its strength. Disagreement is not a flaw of democracy. It is evidence that the system is still alive, that elected representatives are willing to challenge one another in the open under the scrutiny of the nation they serve. But the ultimate judgment does not belong to those sitting behind the microphones in Washington. It belongs to the citizens who listen, who watch, and who decide whether their institutions are living up to the ideals written into the Constitution. Because in the end, democracy is not defined by the speeches made in Congress. It is defined by the willingness of a free people to demand answers, to defend their rights, and to hold power to account whenever those rights are questioned. And that is why moments like this matter. They remind us that freedom is not preserved by silence. It is preserved by scrutiny, by debate, and by the courage to ask difficult questions in the halls of power. If you believe in transparency, accountability, and the importance of informed citizens, stay with us. Subscribe to Liberty Report USA.